A dense fog blanketed the streets of London, swirling around the towering silhouette of Westminster Abbey. It was an evening steeped in mystery, and the air carried a peculiar weight, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Sherlock Holmes, ever the insomniac, had been summoned by an urgent letter delivered just moments before. "Holmes, you've barely finished your tea," Watson remarked, as his friend tossed on his coat. "No time for pleasantries, Watson. Inspector Lestrade insists it's a matter of national importance," Holmes replied, his voice clipped and intense. They arrived at Westminster Abbey to find Lestrade waiting at the great oak doors, his face pale as chalk. "It's the Lord Chancellor, Holmes, found dead in the Abbey crypt of all places." Holmes raised an eyebrow. The crypt? Curious. Was he known to frequent such places in life? Lestrade grimaced. "Not to my knowledge, but that's not all. The only clue we've found is this." He held out a folded piece of parchment, smeared with ash. Scrawled upon it, in an unsteady hand, were the words, "The shadows always return." "Interesting," Holmes murmured, tucking the parchment into his pocket. "Lead the way." In the crypt, the scene was grim. The Lord Chancellor lay sprawled across the cold stone floor, his hand frozen in a final gesture, as though reaching for something unseen. Around him were strange marks on the floor, patterns burned into the stone in a haphazard spiral. "Watson, what do you see?" Holmes asked, crouching low to inspect the marks. Watson squinted, then shook his head. "Burns, certainly, but how they were made here, underground, is beyond me." "Precisely," Holmes said, pulling out his magnifying glass. "Lestrade, was there any sign of forced entry?" "None," Lestrade replied. "The Abbey was locked tight, as always." "Then we are dealing with someone who had access, and perhaps knowledge of this place's deeper secrets." Holmes stood abruptly, his gaze darting around the crypt. His nostrils flared. "Do you smell that, Watson?" Watson sniffed. "Sulfur?" "Indeed. A theatrical choice, meant to invoke fear." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Lestrade, fetch me the Abbey's records. I'll wager this crypt holds more than the Lord Chancellor's remains." Hours later, by the light of a single flickering candle, Holmes pored over the Abbey's records. Watson watched as his friend's finger traced a line of text, then stopped abruptly. "Here it is," Holmes declared. "The Lord Chancellor was a member of a secret society, a rather ambitious group calling themselves the Order of Eternal Light. Their charter speaks of eternal vigilance against shadows." "Shadows?" Watson frowned. "Surely not literal shadows." "Not literal, no," Holmes replied, "but metaphorical. Forces of corruption and greed within the government. And if I'm correct, the Order's ritual involved, here it is, a ceremonial dagger. Watson, we must find that dagger." The dagger, as it turned out, was hidden in plain sight, in a reliquary beneath the Abbey altar. It was ornate, its hilt inlaid with rubies, and its blade engraved with Latin scripture. Holmes inspected it closely, then smiled. A masterpiece of craftsmanship, but also a key. "A key to what?" Lestrade asked, puzzled. Holmes tapped the hilt. "To a hidden chamber. Notice the faint wear on the base. This dagger has been turned many times, likely in a concealed lock mechanism. The question is, where?" They found the lock beneath a forgotten statue in the crypt. When Holmes inserted the dagger and twisted, the statue shifted with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward. The air grew colder as they descended. At the bottom, they found a hidden chamber, its walls lined with shelves of ancient tomes and documents. And there, sitting at a grand oak table, was a man, alive. "Lord Edmonds," Lestrade gasped. The man looked up, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Ah, so you found me. Too late, I'm afraid." Holmes stepped forward, calm as ever. "Not too late to stop whatever scheme you've orchestrated, Lord Edmonds. The crypt, the dagger, the sulphur. It was all theatre, wasn't it? To make your rivals believe the order had turned on itself." Edmonds laughed. "And what if it was? The order's secrets are mine now. Their power, their influence. It will reshape this city." Holmes smiled faintly. "Not if we expose you first." The night ended with Lord Edmonds in custody and the order's secrets preserved. As dawn broke over London, Holmes and Watson walked back to Baker Street in silence. Finally, Watson spoke. "Do you think we've seen the last of Edmonds's shadows?" Holmes glanced at the sunrise, his expression unreadable. "Shadows, Watson, are only as powerful as the light that casts them, but we must always remain vigilant." And with that, they disappeared into the bustling morning crowd, leaving the shadows of the Abbey behind.